Welcome to the Combined Air Emissions Reporting webinar. Today's speakers are Marc Houyoux of EPA's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards in the Air Quality Assessment Division, and Bryan Shaw, Chairman of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. My name is Megan Parker with Ross Strategic, and I'm supporting today's webinar. Before I turn it over to our speakers, I'm going to cover some logistics for today's webinar. So you may have noticed that everyone comes in muted. That is to reduce background noise during the presentation. And so if you have questions throughout the webinar, you can chat those into your dashboard using the questions field, and we will be able to see those. We are going to wait until after the presentation to tee up the Q&A, but you can go ahead and enter those throughout the presentation, and then we will get to those after the call. So you can either type in your specific question or say, I have a question, and we'll get you in the question queue, and I can unmute you when we get to the Q&A period. In addition to that, in order to be unmuted, you need to, if you are using the telephone option, you need to enter in your audio PIN, and so that's within the audio portion of your dashboard. And so if this 72 is not your PIN number, you will see a unique PIN number within your audio section of the dashboard. So please go ahead and enter that now if you haven't done so. And automatically the dashboard will minimize itself, and so you'll see a reddish-orange arrow on either the left or right side of your screen, and you can click that to maximize and minimize the window throughout the presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Bryan Shaw.
Thank you, Megan. Hi, I'm Bryan Shaw, and I'm the Chairman of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and I'm going to sort of give us an overview and run through some of, hopefully answering some of the questions about what e-enterprise is, why we're interested, and kind of how it came to be. I'll start off with the slide on your screen. You can tell that this is a project that is jointly governed by the state, local, and tribes, the SLTs, and the EPA to collaboratively modernize these business processes. The goal being to not only improve the environmental results, but to also enhance the services to the regulated community and the public by making government more efficient, effective, or in more real terms, it's basically to make government work better, to make sure we minimize the hassle, the errors introduced by getting data from the source where it's being first generated and where it's utilized by the state, locals, and tribes, as well as the EPA. The Combined Air Emissions Reporting Project has arisen from two similar proposals from back in the spring of 2014 made by Arizona and the EPA, and so this sort of is the after development of what sort of started out in Arizona and working with the EPA trying to find ways to make government better. With that sort of very broad overview, the next thing we want to do before we really get started into this is go to the next slide, which will show that we're looking at taking a poll to get a sense of who's on the call. And so part of what we want to do is walk you through getting an opportunity for you to tell us what kind of organization you're with. And I'll turn it back over to Megan to walk us through that, and then I'll come back and do a little more of the overview of what this is all about.
Great, thank you. So I am going to launch the poll now. And the first question is, what type of organization are you associated with? Okay, so now you should be seeing the opportunity to enter in your response. And so the options are industry, state, local, or tribal agency, EPA, or other. So go ahead and click the most relevant response there, and we'll give you about a minute to do so. About another 10 seconds to enter in your response there. I see almost everyone's voted. Okay, we're going to close the poll now and share the results.
Okay, so an interesting mix. I see that we're about half industry folks, about 3% are with the state and travel agencies, and then 4% for EPA, and then that other, which could be a wide variety of folks that are interested in. So welcome all of you. With that information, there'll be some other polls that we'll be taking towards the end of the presentation, but I want to move back into sort of talking about why we're here today, and specifically after having given the overview of what we're dealing with e-enterprise, I'll now focus on the combined air emissions reporting project that we're specifically focusing on, and the next slide will show that we're dealing with. This is looking at point sources and primarily focusing on the 4 major air reporting programs: the toxics release inventory, the greenhouse gas reporting program, and then the compliance and emissions data reporting interface, or CEDRI, and then finally the national emissions inventory. Some of the things that make it unique and that we deal with in both the challenges with making this project work, but also part of the advantage and opportunity to make it work, is recognizing that these different programs have different pollutants that they're concerned with. There's different facility definitions, which can be a challenge to make sure that when we refer to a facility or we tag data by facility, that it means the right thing and that we're using it, especially when you're looking at using data that comes from different programs. We're trying to make sure that those programs are accurate in the data that they have. Oftentimes you have different data resolution, whether it's at a facility or sub-facility level, and then the types of data, whether it's emissions or stack test data. And so there's a lot of challenges along with that as well. And some of these programs have been around a bit longer than others, and that does also change sort of where they are, provide some challenges for us to deal with. And then, of course, it wouldn't be quite challenging enough without the last bullet point here, and that is that there's different ways the data goes from the source where it's being generated to the final report, especially when you look at the fact that the National Emissions Inventory, the NEI, includes state, local, and tribe. And so there are some unique challenges with how you go about making sure that we're getting the data in, that we're not losing opportunities for the states, local, and the tribes to be able to do QA, quality assurance, quality control on the data. And so those are some issues that are certainly of importance to us. See if I can get it to where you let me advance to the next slide. There we go. And so looking at the sort of a high-level summary of this, the EPA and the state, local, and tribe agencies are collecting air data for many different programs I talked about before. In order to sort of make sure that we're accurately viewing where we are and where we're going, a diverse team spent about 3 months working to ensure that they had an accurate view of what that future state, or as I like to say, what you sort of ideally have it to look like in the future if this project is successful. And so they were looking at, what are the ideal ways that we might be able to streamline and improve these programs. It had participation from EPA in those 4 program areas that we talked about, as well as the states of Arizona and North Carolina, and then Alcoa, Phillips 66, and the Air Force were participants in that from the standpoint of the regulated community, and trying to ensure that we had access to the concerns and opportunities from that segment as well. In June of last year, return on investment analysis indicated that it would be a positive outcome to have this, but it was uncertain what those savings would be. And I think that's part of the challenge that we have now as we move forward, is to ensure that we're continuing to analyze where those opportunities are, and as we move along to emphasize and amplify the positives while minimizing some of the uncertainties and some of the potential negatives associated with any project moving forward. And so along those lines, there's short-term win projects that are ongoing, trying to make sure that we're taking advantage of those things that lead to positive results early on with minimal input. And so we're trying to take advantage of those low-hanging fruits as they exist. The goals, obviously, I think sort of characterized on what I talked about earlier, is that we're trying to make sure that the government's more efficient, especially from the environmental regulatory and reporting standpoint. One of the key goals that I think that is certainly interesting to me is to reducing the industry burden for those point source reporting programs. There are opportunities to streamline that, to remove some of the duplicate reporting, as well as hopefully improve the accuracy by minimizing data reentry and what have you associated with that. Obviously, improving timeliness and transparency of the data can be achieved if we're doing so in a way that's consistent, that sort of we've ironed out any of the concerns and discrepancies between the different programs. There's opportunities for that to be streamlined, be much smoother, again, hopefully with more accuracy. And then having consistent information across the air emissions program, I think is key and something we need to be striving for, either with this program or without this program. Improving data quality, I've touched on that a couple of times. Obviously, we can answer those questions, make sure we get the proper process for entering data, processing that data. It takes out some of the opportunities for human error, whether it be transcription or other. Improving accessibility and usability of data. You have to make sure that we're certain that data is used in a way that's appropriate and intended and not misused or misunderstood. And then support more timely decision making. Obviously, if you can streamline the timing from data entry to going through the QA/QC, that's better. But we need to make sure that we don't get too far ahead of that and sacrifice accuracy for timeliness. So this particular slide you see now sort of describes where we are today, what that process looks like. You can tell the little icon of the emission source at the top of this flow chart, and you can see where the different attributes and emissions would go either to EPA for them to publish, either review and publish in each of the different program areas, or with regards to the National Emissions Inventory, that would go with involvement of the states, locals, and tribes, and go through that process where that would then get transmitted to EPA to be published. And then you have the source test data where there's a little bit of a feedback loop that comes in where that data comes in. So that's sort of where we are today, and in a moment I'll show you a similar diagram of where this vision is for where this might go ultimately to hopefully streamline some of that process. Before I do that, I'll talk about some of the key inefficiencies that may be eliminated or if not at least reduced. And as I mentioned a couple of times already, duplicative and inconsistent facility and facility matching type data, so we can do those things. We take out some of those opportunities for error and or inconsistency. Data entry, hopefully we can streamline that and make sure that we make that less burdensome for the regulated industry and the reporting industries. Some of the wait time calls by that review process to the state, local, tribe on the NEI process. Again, I think a key is that I and hopefully certainly others are interested in making sure that while we're looking to be streamlining the timing component of that we have to make sure we maintain the opportunity for input by those states, locals, and tribes, and also ensure the accuracy is there. There is potential also to reduce and remove some requirements to certainly streamline other augmentation steps associated with the NEI that hopefully can also not only be less burdensome, but also hopefully helps to answer some of the questions so we maintain an accuracy and we don't have issues with regard to whether or not it's being done properly. Some duplicative post-submission QA/QC may be able to be resolved and eliminated or streamlined. Again, key focus there, me as a state person want to make sure that we're able to make sure that we're comfortable with the use of data and maintain the quality of that data for our uses that may be different than what EPA uses for those data are. Inconsistent emission data across programs associated with program and associated work and reconciliation of that. So some issues there, there may be some opportunity again to make that process move smoother, which then leads us to what that future system may look like. You can see in this we again have our sources where the data is being collected, and you see this portal, and take a minute to talk about this because there are some concerns about, am I going to lose the portal? I like the way I report to my state now. Personally, as one of those states that thinks we have a pretty good system in, I'm certainly interested in trying to maintain the opportunity for us to keep the data submission system that we have, but just to make sure that we make the connections between the data that we already have in our state where they will meet and flow seamlessly into the EPA's program. This will also provide opportunities for either an EPA portal program where you could enter into that, and the states would then therefore not have to develop their own program, and or there may be opportunities for states to borrow what some other states are doing and be able to make sure that we have systems that work well, that meet the state's needs, that also provide funneling that data into EPA well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here. The key is once we learn to match up the facilities and identify all those concerns where we can accurately characterize what the data is and what it means, then we just have to make sure that the different databases talk together. And again, that could be if that data lives at the state site and is shared seamlessly to the federal site, or it could be that would be housed at the federal site if the state, local, or tribes chose to do so. So basically, once all that data is entered, then the system would take that, combine those shared facility attribution systems, and iron all that out as we're in the process of working through now. That then would feed that data into the different databases that EPA has for those different program areas in a way that we've already identified the challenges to make sure that QA/QC is taken care of, that the state rules are honored and working, and then that would then facilitate being distributed to unified public access for those data streams. So if we get all this done right, you make sure you do it right the first time, and then you're able to make sure that that data quality continues forward. Of course, you always have to be careful if you're developing a black box. We want to make sure that we vet it properly and that we have in place systems so that we can assure as we go down the road, and 5 years, 10 years down the road, that those data processes are still accurate and the changes that may occur are accurately reflected in the processing of that data. So not without its challenges, but certainly there's benefits there that would hopefully justify those investments. Some of the common concerns that we're going to continue to address, and some that I want to make sure that we single out that we are looking at today, are concerns about will EPA dictate how everything will change. And again, I'll point out, and I'm one of those who takes some comfort in this, as well as some commitment to making sure this continues, and that is this is a joint effort between EPA and the state, local, and the tribe, and that we're going to continue working together in protecting those interests of each of those parties. Have all decisions been made? Certainly not. We're going to continue reaching out to work with the states, locals, and industry. A number of industry, almost half of you today are representing industry, to make sure that we have that input to make sure it's being done right. So I encourage you to continue to address and share concerns that you have. Obviously, a lot of work has been done, and so we can't reinvent the wheel and start completely over, but that doesn't mean as we go along we can't find ways to tweak what's being done, and certainly if there are unexpected outcomes that need to be addressed, or even that would say we need to rethink about things, we need to know those sooner is better than later, obviously, but at any point along the way we need to make sure that we're careful and we'll continue to ask those questions. Is this a single big data system that everyone uses? And of course, the answer to that is no. This is for a connected network, and I explained that some, where it would allow for ownership by the state, folks, the tribes who want to keep it, or support the state, folks, tribe that may need more help. So if they don't have the resources to be able to maintain all that data, this should facilitate that outcome as well. And you should be able to choose. It shouldn't necessarily be that everyone is doing the same. You should be able to choose what works best for you. And then, of course, how do you, when you're dealing with something besides the federal government and big projects, how do we avoid the pitfalls of past large projects? And efforts are underway to try to make sure that doesn't happen and this works well. And so there's a process that's being utilized to try to make sure we're getting the most value for the least amount of work. And so we're trying to make sure as a part of that we're getting a lot of feedback. So we encourage you to be a part of that to make sure as we go along that we're getting proper feedback to where we're avoiding the opportunities for this to come off the rails and optimizing that benefit. So at this point is kind of when we want to change lanes or switch over a little bit, and at this point I'll ask Marc Houyoux, who is with the EPA Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards, to lead us through the next component of the presentation. So here's Marc.
Thanks, Henry. I'm just going to wait here for a second for control. Oh, I have it now. Good. Okay, so as Henry was describing, we've been working on this since last year, and we completed our return on investment analysis last year in June. The burden reduction to industry that was estimated was in the millions of dollars per year through the streamlining. The air agency costs over 5 years, and this includes states, was also expected to be impacted. So under this approach, we expect that there would be some costs in the short term in terms of infrastructure, and then in the longer term, savings and reductions in FTE. Now, one thing that I will note is while the ROI results were positive, we actually did not at that time factor in the potential improvements in the IT development of the Agile process that Henry that Bryan had mentioned. And so we are hopeful that that will further improve the ROI results when things actually get done. As I said, the AIR agency benefits include reductions to FTEs that would be needed to support emissions work, and in addition, for the folks who are spending a lot of their time doing that now, they would be able, we believe, to spend more time focusing on quality, and that's the case here at EPA as well as state, local, tribal agencies. And then there's a lot of unquantified benefits included in that ROI, including improved transparency, improved timeliness, accessibility, consistency, and the increased use of shared data services, which is something that eEnterprise highly promotes as a way to allow us to leverage each other's work rather than separately reinvent the wheel on these types of transactions. As part of the scoping effort last year, we identified 5 short-term win projects, and all of these projects are intended to lead the path towards the path for the full implementation, but the resources being what they were, we needed to start with a few baby steps to improve the status quo, start heading down this path, and move in the right direction. The CAER implementation plan is one of those. You can see the long list of state participants in that, and that work is, all these projects are expected to finish up by June or so of this year. We are improving the WebFire system, which is EPA's location for emission factors for storing, creating, and searching for emission factors for estimating emissions. And that system is getting search improvements and consolidation of an export of the industry test data that's now coming in through the CEDRI system. And again, we have 4 state partners on that project. We also have a data dictionary project, which is looking across reporting systems at the data elements in those systems and looking for where those elements are the same and where they're different, and maybe in some cases where they have the same name but mean something different, and looking for the overlap. And in addition to the data elements, also looking at the code tables for emissions. We have various codes that are used to describe the emissions in a meaningful way, and harmonizing those is going to be one of the things that will need to be looked at as part of this project. While ultimately we hope to include all the states in this work, that particular short-term win is involving 3 states, and we are looking at North Carolina and Texas data systems and their data dictionaries in this project. We are also doing a project related to source classification codes, which are process codes used in inventories. And the web-based service on this project will allow for online publication through web services of the official latest source classification code list. We would like to get away from the current situation where there's numerous places someone could go to get a list, and oftentimes the lists get out of sync, or it's hard to get updated SCC or a new SCC. We want to make that easier for folks. And that is a stepping stone because these process descriptions are critical for some parts of the emissions reporting that we're talking about here, in particular the NEI program and the state reporting programs, state, local, and tribes. And then lastly, in the NEI part of the picture here, we have what's called EPA augmentation, and that is when EPA adds things to the inventories that we get from state, local, and tribes, and that can cause confusion. And we are working to identify the root causes of why there's things missing that we need to augment and eliminate those causes so that no augmentation or much less augmentation will be necessary. And that what we've seen already on this project is a great communication about this issue with the large number of states involved in that project. And we're already getting a much better understanding of each other and working towards making improvements in that area. So while we've been working on the CAER project, another part of eEnterprise has been working on the portal. And last October, EPA launched this new eEnterprise portal. You can see the address there. It is currently showing facility level information. So you can see in the screenshot there the example where the facility name, address, coordinates, etc. are shown. And the CEDRI system is actually using this portal as part of its interface with facilities. So when facilities come in to report their stack test data to CEDRI, this is one of the things that they would see. And I simply included this to try to give some tangible evidence that we are headed in this direction where once all of the reporting systems are leveraging this sharing of facility attributes, we will have the capability for facilities to come in once and to provide that information and share it among the agencies so that it won't get out of sync and it can be much more readily matched across different programs, etc. So we're really excited about the progress the portal has made already, and one of the next steps will be to start looking at sub-facility information and adding that into the portal. So here at EPA and working with our state partners, we have a 6-month project that's kicking off the implementation phase. My role is typically a first-line supervisor, but I'm taking a 6-month detail, we call it here at EPA, to kick off this implementation phase. And we, in addition, in EPA have assigned a full-time employee to lead this project full-time. And his name is Joe Mangino. He's currently shadowing me, and we'll pick this work up in August later this year. We're also reviewing a new FRS data model for its ability to support the needs of this project for sharing of the facility attributes. Traditionally, FRS has looked only at, primarily at the facility level and has put together data that's been taken in various different ways and tried to match things up. The new model will allow for this more authoritative pushing of information to the various programs while still helping with the curation of the data and working differently with other parts of the agency and other agencies at the state, local, and tribes to make sure that everyone is happy with the information that's in there. That, of course, would interface, as I showed before, with the portal that we've worked on already in some way. And so to start investigating that, we are working with the FRS team, the portal team, and state and local tribes to use this vision of CAER as a framework to collect facility attributes for a project that we have here in OEQPS called Residual Risk and Technology Review Efforts. And the thinking is that by streamlining and collecting the facility attributes in this way, we'll be able to further improve the collection process for residual risk and technology, as well as demonstrate the feasibility and power of this approach. In addition, we're working right now to compile and compare EPA and state, local, tribal regulations that require the emissions to be submitted from industry, and doing that in a way that will feed an analysis that can then be used to help understand the differences and similarities to then help feed the streamlining approach. And the last thing we're doing actively now is we're actively reaching out to stakeholders, and this is one example here in this webinar. Because of these things that are going on, there's a number of opportunities for interested parties to get involved. For the state, local, and tribes, there is currently an ongoing review of SLT needs and concerns related to this concept of sharing facility attributes. And actually, I think the due date for comments for that is today. but please let me know if you're interested in knowing more about that. We also will be needing to develop together business rules for sharing this information, so that is an upcoming opportunity. We are now compiling the emission reporting regs, but there's going to be a review coming up so that states can see what we've compiled and make sure we've interpreted the public information about their regulations properly. So that will be another upcoming opportunity to review what we've done on emissions reporting regulation documentation. In our short-term wind project, we'll be having beta testing of the upcoming SCC web service. And we also will have beta testing associated with the enhancements eventually to the e-enterprise portal for the sub-facility attributes related to that RTR project I mentioned earlier. On the industry side, we are interested in learning more about what improvements can help you the most in this arena of emissions reporting. We also need help understanding how some of the complex facilities out there map to the multiple programs, whether that's the state's requirements, the TRI, the GHG reporting program. In some cases, the way that facility maps to those programs is different, and the data model that FRS has developed will support that, but we need some use cases, some examples to help us stretch the model to make sure that the way the data is being stored and handled is going to be effective for this project. And we also will have an opportunity for beta testing of the e-enterprise portal for sub-facility attributes coming up. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Megan now on these poll questions.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so we have 2 more poll questions coming up, and so I will go ahead and launch the next one. So as you did in the beginning of the webinar, go ahead and enter in your selection. Give it about another 30 seconds. Okay, take your last opportunity to enter in your selection for the poll question, and I'm going to close it in about 5 seconds. Okay, so you should be seeing the results now. Mark, if you want to look at those. And
okay, well, this is somewhat encouraging. I think hopefully we've captured a new group of folks on the call today, and so it's understandable that there's some uncertainty. I think that's represented well by the could be beneficial, and then for some of you feel committed enough to say would be, so that's also great to see. Good. So for those of you who aren't sure or don't know and are still interested in this, please reach out and let us know how we can help you better understand what we're talking about.
great. I'll go ahead and launch the second poll question now. Well, the third one. Okay, so this is our last poll question, and you should be seeing that up on your screen now. So if you thought this could be beneficial, where do you see benefits? And you can select more than one response. Another 10 seconds to go ahead and get all your votes in there. Okay, I'm closing this poll and showing the results. So you should all be seeing the results on your screen now.
Well, this is good because there's not too much on the other, and that means we've kind of hopefully got some of the top benefits captured on the poll. I would like to point out that for the survey that will come at the end, not sure, I guess Megan will talk a little bit more about that. There is an opportunity to also share your concerns. We figured since those are so potentially varied that we would just allow a free-form response for the concerns at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yep, thanks, Mark. So when the webinar ends today, you will be prompted with a few questions that you can fill in, and we appreciate any responses. And as Mark said, there are spots for concerns as well as some other some other questions, just 3 quick questions at the end of this. Okay, so I will turn us back to the slides here and move this forward. Back to you, Mark.
Oops, I was on mute. Sorry about that. During registration, folks were able to submit questions if they had them. So we'll start with these as sort of feeder questions, and I'll take a stab at the first one. So does this mean that states and EPA will have consistent reporting regulations, such as thresholds, sources, and deadlines? Well, we've acknowledged throughout the project that there could be reporting reg changes that are needed. But we are not starting there because we think that there's a lot of capability for sharing information without doing that. So for example, we don't necessarily think that we have to change submittal dates to keep the data in sync. So TRI has the first reporting deadline for a HAP pollutant, and then after that deadline, the facility may also need to report sorry, I'm abbreviating, hazardous air pollutant is what I meant when I said HAP. They may need to report that also to the state for their regulation. And the way this could work is if those second reported emissions, the second time are different from what had been reported previously, then a few different things could happen. So the facility could be notified as they were submitting the information, hey, this is different from what you said before. Are you really wanting to change your value? And it may be that it's an error. They could also say, yep, that is correct. We also want to submit this as a change to TRI, and it would come into TRI, and then that program could decide what to do with that information. So that's just one example, and I think there's probably others you can imagine based on that where without changing deadlines, we would be able to allow for that sort of sharing of information and let the programs decide what to do with the information. In terms of sources, there's certainly no need to have every source report to every, for every reg, simply to use a similar approach, right? So depending on what source the source is subject to would dictate what parts of their data would go to the different programs and how they would have to provide that information. And the same thing would be true of thresholds that dictate which sources are in or out of a particular rule. On the second question, how do you intend to keep everyone informed of updates to the system, process, tables, etc. on an ongoing basis? One of the things we talked about during the lean event that led to our proposed future state was the idea that right now the information that the agencies share about their reporting program changes is not done in a streamlined way. It's basically everybody is going out to the industry to try and indicating all of their different requirements separately. We haven't decided exactly how this could be improved, but we did identify it as one thing that could be improved to help the facilities and industry to not have to get so much separate information and try to put it all together for what it means, but to be a little bit more mindful of all the different requirements and try to figure out a way to provide that in a more streamlined basis. As far as to the extent that this question was really applying to the evolution of this project and just understanding how and when things are going to change, and there's some questions about that on this slide a little bit lower down, but we are looking very closely at innovative ways of sharing information about this project. And we hope to provide a very transparent way of allowing people to go and see when they have a chance, go and see what the status is, as opposed to us having a webinar like we're having today and doing that on an infrequent basis. We want to have a more open process than that. But we haven't figured that out. We have some options, but we're still trying to figure that out. How will the TRI data interface work? So, you know, before the webinar, it probably wasn't clear that we haven't gotten to that level of detail on this project yet. We haven't proposed any changes to any interface yet, and so we don't know the answer to that question. How would sources enter facility attributes like stack heights and other changes? I think our vision right now is that in some cases that would be able to come in through the portal, but in some other cases there are going to be state programs where that information is entered now, and those state programs will still exist and will share their information with the portal or share their information with the shared facility attributes part of the system. So I think we don't know the answer to that, and but we have this vision of, for a given facility, that place to go would be one place, and it wouldn't need, that type of information wouldn't need to be entered in multiple places, but rather it would be up to the agencies to share that information. Brian, would you want to tackle the confidential question number 5? Sorry to put you on the spot. But
No problem at all. You know, and I think this is another one of those things that gets to the fact that there's a number of issues that we need to work through. Obviously, keeping confidential information is important, and part of what the teams are having to do is making sure that the data that and sometimes this varies, by the way, from what states are allowed to release and not. And so we need to make sure that as we build these systems, that we're taking that into account where we're able to ensure that data that needs to be kept confidential will be. And so part of that has to do with making sure that as we're building these databases, that information that can be transmitted and be publicly available goes through one stream, and we tag other information that may be necessary for EPA and would currently be submitted, but that would maintain that confidentiality going forward. And so I think the key there is once you have an understanding of how to bring the data in and to characterize the data properly, then we can automate that process of ensuring that data that needs to be confidential is kept confidential. I don't know if you have something to add or clarify on that, Mark.
No, you're absolutely right. I think the goal has been to anything that's currently being kept confidential to try to do that as well, to keep it confidential. One of the things that we have noted is some data fields are treated as confidential CBI, confidential business information, in some programs, and in other programs it's not. So it just raises the question, well, if we're going to be sharing this, how can something be confidential in one program and not another? And that would have to be sort of sorted through. But this is an important aspect of the project to make sure that we are inspiring confidence by keeping things confidential that need to be. Potential changes to SEC codes. I think I talked a little bit about that project already. The project is not focusing on changing SEC codes at this time. There certainly is a potential need for that in the future as this project moves forward. But the changes, again, are making them publicly available as a web service, having a improved search capability to make sure folks can find the right SECs, and trying to eliminate the separate posting of SEC codes all over the place that can lead to inconsistencies. And then lastly, making it more clear when new processes are developed that need their own SEC codes, making it clear how that can be requested and accomplished.
And Mark, with regard to sort of your discussion about SEC codes, would you agree that it's sort of the plan of the project at this point? It's less about changing what's happening as it is about identifying what we currently have and finding ways to make sure those line up. Obviously, in the process, we may identify changes that need to be made, but I know there's a question that we'll address in a moment, perhaps, about systems that are working and processes are working, and is this going to be the expectation, for example, that the states will go in and change the way they're currently doing things, whether it be facility ID or what have you. And I think the answer, especially in the short run, is not necessarily. Ideally, as long as it's accurate and we can find ways to properly characterize it, the idea would be that this effort would identify how we take, at least as an option, the current way data are being entered. Hopefully you streamline that some, but those common things are in place, and make sure that that information that's already being submitted in its current form is properly understood and automatically submitted to the different programs. So in other words, it wouldn't necessarily be that, in fact, it's not what we're looking for, is to say we're going to figure out what the best way to do this if we're starting from scratch. But instead we're saying we have these programs that exist. How do we find a way to make them mesh together, identify inconsistencies and changes that may have to be made, but not making changes just to make the process easier. Instead, develop a system to be able to do what we're already doing with manpower, but do it through the database and the system that's running that.
Yeah, I totally agree with how you're describing it, and that's absolutely right and an important point. We're not seeking to make changes just because we have this project. We're really trying to use what we have and make it more streamlined. To the extent things are identified that need to be changed, then we'll have to work together to make that happen. What is the earliest date that you expect to roll out reporting changes to facilities? Yeah, so we don't know. We are still at the collecting information stage for most of the project, so we do not know the answer to that one. What sort of interface will state local emission inventory data systems need to have to retrieve data submitted by industry? This gets at the idea, I mean, this is presupposing that the way the data is coming in is not through the state system, which isn't necessarily the case. But if the data were coming in through the portal for a state that wanted to use the portal to do that, there would need to be defined the way that a state data system would pick that up, and we aren't there yet, right? Because we're still collecting information about how best to do that. But certainly there would be specific requirements that we would need to allow these data systems to communicate with one another, and that's the type of thing that we work in partnership to figure out. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Bryan.
Sure. I just want to echo sort of what we talked about before as well, to make sure that it's clear, is that the vision of this project is not to require going through the portal where states would no longer have their system, but instead, if you like the portal you're using now or like the interface you're using now, ideally we'd be able to keep that. And once that communication is established, then certainly some state locals could choose to maintain the interface they have now, and to that extent, those entities that are reporting may not even notice the difference. It may be that you're doing the same thing you're doing today. It's just that we're going through the heavy lifting of making sure that we understand what that data looks like and that they are able to plug that in to the programs where it needs to go. Or it may be that some states or locals may choose to utilize the portal, and in that case, it leads to the question that is asked here is how do we make sure that the states and locals can extract that information back out. But the key there is making sure that these databases are able to communicate, and that should ideally provide states and locals with options of whether to maintain their own interface or input portal, if you will, or whether to use a more general portal that may be maintained by EPA, for example.
And then the last question, when is the new process planned to be implemented? We are hoping we get the resources this year to start beta testing of some small pieces of what we've talked about. But in terms of the whole new process and having everything done, that question is sort of presupposing that a different model than what we're doing. We expect to take an iterative approach here. So we are going to have pieces of the process that will give us the most benefit, give the facilities and the industry the most benefit with the least amount of change early in the process. And we could see those changes, come out within a year or two. But in terms of the whole glorious, everything is going to be the way we have it in that one diagram that shows how all the connections could be, that's going to really depend on the resources that we're able to secure for this and the degree to which the earlier phases are successful in showing benefit. So Megan, I guess we'll turn that over to you to curate any other questions that are coming in.
Sure, yep. We have a number of them lined up that have been chatted in during the presentation and during this last Q&A session. So just a few logistics before we dive into the actual questions. For those of you participating in the webinar, you can type in, I have a question, and we will get you in the queue to actually ask your question. I will unmute you in order to do that. Again, if you're calling in on your telephone versus mic and speakers, you need to enter your audio PIN in order to be unmuted. You can also chat in what your actual question is, especially if you don't have a mic and can't be unmuted. And so I will go ahead and start unmuting. And first, we have a question from Mike McWilliams. Just one moment. Mike, you should be unmuted.
Yes.
Go ahead and ask your question.
I have a brief statement and then a question. I think you captured well that IT changes and cost are one of the biggest concerns for industry, and you somewhat addressed that in question number 8. The concern that we have, and we're wondering how EPA and the SLT will propose to manage all the different IT platforms that exist in industry today so that we don't have to buy and implement new IT systems to be able to talk to the government systems.
Thanks, Mike. So just to make sure I understand your question, you are wondering if there would be changes needed to your emissions inventory submission system at your facilities to work with the what we're proposing here?
Exactly, and part of that is my lack of knowledge of exactly how many systems we have today and which ones we integrate into EPA systems today and the state systems. I'm just wondering, do we anticipate very many changes required by industry to be able to submit this data in the future?
So I think we don't know exactly but I can tell you the principle that we're operating on here is ultimately something that's going to be effective at saving resources for industry. that may require some upfront changes to how things are reported, but we don't know exactly what that would mean. We also know that these existing systems, whether you're reporting directly to EPA, well, for the systems that you're reporting directly to EPA, are already using some things in common. And so I'm hopeful that those types of changes that would be needed would either be very minimal or possibly no changes at all, and it's the behind-the-scenes stuff that is really taking care of the sharing of the information, but the submissions coming in would potentially be able to use the same data structures that you're already, working with now. It's harder for me to say on the states because each state has its own system and requirements, but to the extent that the fields that are being collected now are required by state regs, you could expect that the data itself would be the same. And then for those data that come to EPA, the structure of that data coming in really would end up being up to how the state needs to do things. It wouldn't really, that part wouldn't necessarily affect industry, except if if there was things that were identified that were needed that aren't needed now. But we're not really looking to do that, as we said earlier.
And Mike,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Mike.
No, that sounds hopeful. Like I said, I think our biggest concern is having to change and have different systems for states and EPA, and even having to change our systems to be more common with other systems. I mean, that's just a cost and eats up a lot of the benefit that this concept has. So anyway, I just wanted to raise that issue, and you've somewhat addressed it, and it's still a work in progress.
It is, Mike, and I would argue that that's one of the things that I think is, one, I'm optimistic that we should be able to minimize that, because part of what I've spoken about consistently, is, especially from the state standpoint, is that hopefully if you like what you're dealing with the state now, that you wouldn't have to change that, and certainly that's my hope that for the state of Texas that would be the case. I would say that the one area where I see it maybe more likely that a change might have to be made is if you're operating in a state that currently maintains its own system, and that state opts to move to where they no longer maintain their program and you just use the portal for all entry, then theoretically there may be some changes that are there, but those should be consistent with what's already going to EPA. So I think that should be very minimal, or hopefully non-existent. So my hope is that there would be very little, if any, change to be required at the facility level.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Now I'm going to turn us over to Joshua Kalfas, and apologies if I mispronounce anyone's names today. Hold on just one moment, and I will unmute you to ask your questions. Joshua, you should be unmuted now.
Actually, this is Kara Radabush. I work with Josh in Oklahoma.
Okay.
My question is, in Oklahoma, we have an air emission inventory reporting system, and it works for our needs in our state. We submit that data to EIS, and what we're hearing is that we will have to match up our facility IDs to a master EPA facility ID. Will our submissions be rejected if they don't have an EPA matching ID?
No. The IDs that you're using now, you would be able to keep using, and any matching issues are done on the back end. And once the matching happens, then it generally wouldn't need to be redone, which is not the case in FRS now. But that was one of the idea of having to having to work with a central system that then changes IDs was one of the objections to FRS in the past that has been addressed, or will be addressed, with the new approach that I spoke about earlier in their new data model. But as far as what you submit, the requirement we aren't planning on changing the requirement to be able to use the state IDs that you're using now.
So, okay, but are we going to have to do any matching on our end before we do the submission?
I don't think so. it's possible that there could be like a one-time project where some matching is done that people could voluntarily participate in, but we don't know. I don't even know if that is needed. Right now, FRS has a number of different matching capabilities that they work on with the regions and states, and so the current vision is that would, once that was, as this new data model gets filled with the data that we're then going to be sharing with the various IDs that the different systems might have for that particular facility, then that matching would be done and there wouldn't ever need to be another matching, and the initial matching in many cases is either already done or would be an automated step. So I just don't envision a lot of manual labor needed to do a lot of matching by the states.
And Kara, this is Brian. This question is one that I was specifically thinking of earlier when, my goal and where I think that this project should be able to do, as Mark was talking about, if it has to be done, it should only have to be done one time. And your data currently is already going through that process, so that means that EPA should have that matching, so it shouldn't require much of any effort on your part, maybe none, ideally, to where that would just be an automated process that would be utilized that would properly link those facility IDs, and you shouldn't have to change anything if everything works well.
Okay, the issue that I particularly see with this is that in Oklahoma we have been down the road of trying to have a consolidated system for tracking, for keeping IDs mapped between the different programs, just here for the environmental programs. We've abandoned it because it takes ongoing work all the time. It always takes a human element. So if this reconciliation has to be done, who's going to be doing it? Are the states going to be doing it, or is EPA going to be doing it?
I guess, we're not, I want to hear more about, your experience with matching, and I don't think we're wanting to build a system that requires constant matching. So, learning from experiences where things haven't worked out is certainly something that we're going to want to do, and if we got to the point of having, that be a continuing problem, then it would certainly be a real issue for this project, no doubt.
Thanks.
Thanks. So, Kara, you had you chatted in some other questions. Do you want to tee those up?
Oh, sure. I'll ask one real quick. So I know that combined air emissions inventory reporting falls under the larger e-enterprise project that's going on. So I'm just kind of curious to know how some of the larger e-enterprise principles will be impacting CAER, especially the idea of possibly approaching regulations that may need to be addressed if certain hurdles are seen and can't be met technologically.
Well, I mean, as I said, we have been aware that there could be regulatory changes needed at some point to, get some of the additional benefit of this project. I think there's only one way that happens, right? It's through the regulatory rulemaking process, notice and comment. But I think one unique aspect of this e-enterprise paradigm is the degree to which the EPA and states are working together to try to affect change and improvement in the situation. And I think that to the extent that we're allowed to do that on the regulations, that we would be able to, do as well as we could with making those things go smoothly. But there's no doubt that any regulatory changes are going to take a lot more time and be a lot more controversial, potentially, than things that simply, seek to streamline and IT solutions that EPA implements.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So it's a possibility. It's just going to try to be avoided. So I just have one last quick question. On the thing that you're going to send out to the states that's discussing regulations, will that also include federal regulations that are relevant, or is focusing on the states?
Yeah, so far the effort has focused on the state regs. We have a separate effort that isn't quite as far along with comparing the federal regs, and the federal regs aren't just the TRI and GHG reporting program. The CEDRI is an expanding list of facilities that are currently having to report, many of which are having to report with not electronic technologies. As those regs are being updated to have the data come in electronically through CEDRI, that list of facilities affected will be growing, but we need to actually be looking ahead at, not just the ones that, there's a handful that are reporting that way now, but we need to be looking ahead at which facilities and how are they subject to those regs. So that's just going to be some additional time that's going to get taken. There's dozens of those that we have to look at. Okay, so AERR stuff will probably come later. Well, and AERR is that's regulation on the states, locals, and tribes. So the changes that would need to be made, it's a little bit, it's a two-step process, right? Because if we need to change something to change the requirement in the AERR, then that means the states would have to change something as well. So we're really not trying to do that. Oh, okay. We just did a revision to the AERR last year, and we actually tried to reduce some of the state's burden, not with the industrial categories. Aside from regular maintenance things like the thresholds for NACs and whatnot, we're not expecting to have to change anything in the AERR anytime soon. Okay, thanks.
Great, thank you. So next we are going to turn over to Jason Marcel. And so Jason, hold on just one moment and I will unmute you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, actually I have two quick questions. I typed them out, let me read them through here. First, just maybe my lack of prior experience with the CEDRI system, but does that currently have the ability to accept stack test reports from industries?
Yes, that's the purpose of it.
Okay, and is that pretty easily retrieved by state and local and tribal officials?
So the CEDRI workflow right now actually has a state review component to it for the states that are participating. And so yes, they're involved. And then in terms of getting the stack test data out, that is direct, one of the short-term wind projects that I mentioned. So the stack test data come in. There's the review process that happens where the state has a role, and then ultimately that data ends up in WebFire for consideration for future emission factor development. And the WebFire enhancement that we're working on now is to be able to pick an industry or an SCC or do other types of searches and then download all of the stack tests, certain fields from the stack test data, and be able to get it in a CSV file or whatever.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate the update. Getting data out is always very important. My second question was related to the NEI. And so in terms of potentially improving the timing of when emissions data becomes publicly available, are you considering shortening the schedule that states would have to submit the NEI each year? Or can you maybe share some of your thoughts on that?
Well, first we want to look at the time between when we get the data from the states and when we are able to publish it, which right now is 6 to 8 months. So that's a lot of potential shortening. And if we were able to get more quality assured data, or if we were able to tell that it met all of the AER reporting requirements sufficiently easier, and part of that would, a lot of the things that we expect to do in this project would facilitate that, then we have an opportunity to be able to cut a lot of time out, at least for the point source part of the NEI. So once we've optimized things on that front, if the demand continues to be for faster, better, cheaper, right? If that demand continued, then we would look and see what other opportunities we have, but that is definitely not where we want to start with putting more pressure on the states than is already there.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So now I'm going to unmute James Tangeman. Hold on just one moment, and I will have you unmuted. Oh, it looks like you need to enter in your audio pin, James. I'll go ahead and just read his question that he's chatted in, and if he gets his audio pin entered in, I'll unmute him. So the question is, will this replace the existing databases for TRI, GHG, etc., or does it allow for entry of all of the data for these systems to be entered in one location only?
So the way the question is asked, I'm not exactly sure if they're talking about the data systems or the interface for reporting, and those aren't the same thing. The TRI, as far as we've discussed it so far, would continue to exist as the behind-the-scenes database. The interface, I think we haven't figured out how TRI interface would work with this. It could be anything from coming into the existing TRIME web in a way that pre-populates more information than is what is there now, pre-populates information based on previous submissions for other programs, and other things that could be provided through the portal, and all the way to changing the way the reporting is done and changing the interface. But we, the folks at TRI have a lot invested in their existing interface. There is a lot of potential concerns, I think, with folks that are, it's working for folks, and I'm sure for some folks it's not, whatever, but that's the type of information we kind of need to collect to figure out the best path forward. So we don't know how it might change or if it will change, but the idea with being able to share as much information as possible in a streamlined way, so from the industry's perspective, that information could come in one way, that's the goal. And how that impacts other systems yet, we just have not been able to figure that out, but we're just getting started on that by collecting the information from folks about their concerns and interests, needs.
Great. So I still can't unmute James, so I will just move to our next question from Sean Taylor. Sean, give me just one moment and I will unmute you. Sean, you should be.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm not on the phone, I'm unsure. I just had a question on how do you ensure CAER compliance, making sure that electronic submittals are, making sure they're signed by responsible officials if those types of things are required, especially for Title V facilities.
Yeah, so a part of the portal project and a related issue is authentication, and that's a separate team has been working on how do we make sure that for a given reporter is who they say they are, and all those types of delegation issues that can come up when you have different people with different roles at different, the industry and even contractors involved in the process. So there is specifically a dedicated effort to making sure that whatever gets implemented will meet the existing requirements and CAER and everything else.
Okay.
Thanks, Sean. Next, we are turning to Tim Burns. And give me just one moment to unmute you. So it looks like we're having getting you unmuted there, Tim. So I will go ahead and tee up your questions. So TRI and air emissions ask different questions, don't they? Wouldn't they therefore have different answers? The first question.
So TRI and the AERR are both asking for the best available emissions. And this was something that came out at our lean event where we realized we are basically asking for the same thing. Now, what does the best available emissions really mean? Well, that kind of depends. So we think that there's room for streamlining there. In the case of the AERR, we aren't requiring the hazardous air pollutants. And so where there are hazardous air pollutants that are in TRI, we are actually incorporating them from TRI in cases when states don't have those available because they also aren't requiring them. But we think that there is definitely room for streamlining in that the ultimate end goal for what we expect to get for NEI from the state, if they're reporting HAPs and what TRI is asking for, where those pollutants are in common, they're not, and there's not always the same pollutants, but when there's plenty that are the same, that we would want to get those to be more consistent or completely consistent.
Great, thanks. So Tim's second question is, will the web fire of the future be simplified to have one emission factor per pollutant per SCC? Similarly, will there be a general/average control factor for each type of control equipment for the various pollutants?
Yeah, we're going to have to take that question down and get the web fire folks here. But I don't think we can have one per pollutant per SCC. In part because of the the impacts of controls and different types of controls, general matter. But yeah, I think maybe we can capture your question as well as your contact information and put you in touch with the web fire lead at EPA.
And Mark, just to me, it doesn't seem like that's impacted by this project as much as that's a part of the overall process that would happen with or without this project. Do you agree with that? There's nothing about it.
It's a bit of a side issue.
Right. And I don't mean it's not important. I just mean that the things that we're talking about today are impacting that. That can happen or not happen, regardless of whether or not we're going through the streamlining process with the combined emission reporting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is that whole area of using emission factors for emissions is, a real challenge. I mean, we're really hoping to build out our understanding of emissions through the way CEDRI is collecting information and the ability of it to collect a stack test, and then the way WebFire is being built to, in a more automated and streamlined way, review and potentially propose new emission factors. And I think people probably, that person asking that question probably sees that, we haven't always done the best job as we could in terms of making emission factors available, and this project really, I think, seeks to improve that. And then we will be having to have those discussions at some point about, well, what is it going to look like for folks who have access to new emission factors, and how will we want those to be used? And I think that's kind of might be what they were getting at. So I agree that it's not the core function of this project to create new things, but in that particular case, we kind of are creating a new thing, just because there's been so much of a slowdown over the past few years of new emission factor data compared to maybe the need.
Very good.
Great. So Justin, Finke, I'm going to unmute you right now. You should be unmuted. Justin, are you there? Do you want to ask your question? Okay, well, I will go ahead and read Justin's, it's more of a comment than a question. So referring to the questions that are up on the screen, question 8 is likely the single biggest roadblock and or technical challenge you will face I respect that you are not at that point yet, but I strongly recommend you beginning planning for these challenges. Particularly, you will need strong tech help to find efficient ways to make foreign databases play nice. Please respect that challenge.
Oh, absolutely. We're taking very seriously the need to look for effective technical solutions behind the scenes. We've made some progress in that area, and we hope with some prototyping to be able to demonstrate some capability, but you know, we're not quite there yet, so stay tuned on that. But thank you. I think that's good advice. Was there a question in there though?
No, I think it was more just a comment. So we can move to the next question, which is from Wendy Blake Coleman. She doesn't have audio capability, so I'm just going to ask it. It's, do you have a project plan schedule?
So the implementation short-term win is going to produce that, and that implementation plan we hope will be available. We're planning on being available by June of this year.
Great. And so next up is Ellen Collins. Ellen, I am going to go and unmute you just momentarily. Ellen, you are unmuted now. Go ahead. Ellen, are you there? Okay. I'm going to mute her again, but the question is, this is a very large and complex undertaking. Does this project have a green light in its entirety, and which system interface do you anticipate would be worked on first?
So it doesn't have a green light in its entirety. It has a commitment that it's an important effort, and as I said, we're waiting for resources. There are resources specifically identified for this in the 2017 budget planning process, but and we've asked for other resources for this year. So yes, it's a huge project, and so that gets back to the iterative and stepwise nature of how we would like to proceed. I think at this point, while we haven't made any specific commitments, it seems evident that working on the sharing of the facility attributes is a very good starting point. It's very difficult to build sharing of emissions data until you're sharing facility attributes, and so it's likely that is where we're going to start. And a lot of that can be done without changing any of the incoming reporting streams, simply by trying to figure out how best to where the sharing needs to happen, how to implement that across data systems, and start making the what we hope to be the consistently improving quality of information that will be in FRS available to outside entities to access electronically. I don't know if you have another take on that or not, Brian, but the more we've talked about this, from where I'm sitting, it seems like those facility attributes are so central.
Yeah, I think those are certainly taking a lot of time and effort, and recognizing that if you don't get those done right, then can come of that. So I agree.
Thanks. So the next is really a comment from Brian Fraser, who doesn't have audio, so I will read it. New facilities open over time, and new facilities likely to need to report to multiple EPA and SLT systems. The reconciliation will be an ongoing process. Just a comment there, not a question.
Yeah, so there is a vision that there's another project, an e-permitting project, that is in a much earlier stage of development through e-enterprise. And if we were able to connect permitting phase of the facility creation to the emissions phase and to what we're trying to do here with CAER, as I would point out, some states have already done for their state. I think that while there are going to be new facilities coming in and there are going to be purchases of parts of facilities and other complicated things, we're aware of all those types of things that we need to be able to handle. The FRS team has been aware of those, and we're hoping to get as many get those types of examples through continued participation and insights from folks like the folks on this call to make sure we're going to get it right.
Okay, great. So response earlier to Justin's statement, he doesn't have audio, so I will read. Now there's some follow-up questions. So he's just offering a question in response to his comment. I was very underwhelmed when I got my hands on the ERT, which is really just a simple Microsoft Access database. What technologies or database tools do you expect to use for this project? What databases are some SLTs using?
Well, I will say, in defense of the ERT folks, they recognize that they need to improve, and they've been actually trying to get the resources they need to build a web-based ERT. So I think that message has come through loud and clear to that team. As far as what technologies at this stage, I can't say, because it starts to get into what contractors we might use. So I can't talk about that, but we are looking at technologies that will allow very quick prototyping, will allow workflows and permissions and business rules to be defined and implemented in an iterative and a low maintenance kind of way. Was there another part? I feel like there was another part of the question that I didn't address.
The second part of the question was, what databases are some SLTs using?
Oh, well, I can't answer that. There's plenty of SLTs on the phone if they want to share.
Sure.
And I'm not that I don't want to share, I just can't accurately characterize what we're using. I know what our system is to us, but I can't put it in terms that would make sense to you, so I have to talk to our staff before I can characterize that. But I think the key takeaway is that there's been a lot of advancement in these capabilities, and I hope that as we move through with this program, we can respect those states that have systems that are working, possibly even make it where others can share those, and anything new that's developed can utilize some of the advancements that have been made to make it more robust and more user-friendly.
Great. So I'm just going to do a time check here. We are at the end of our hour-and-a-half webinar. We're almost through the questions. I think there's maybe 2 more left in the actual chat function. And of course, this is one ongoing piece of the ongoing communication, and there will be time in the future for more questions. Marc and Bryan, would you like to just tee up 1 or 2 more questions, or should we go ahead and end now and you can follow up with those participants after?
I have about 15 more minutes if that's enough.
Great. Bryan, does that work for you?
Sorry, sure. My computer is down, so I won't be able to see the questions, but if you can ask them verbally, I can take care of it a little bit longer.
Sure. So I am going to move to Joshua again to unmute. Joshua, you should be unmuted, or Kara maybe. From Oklahoma.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so we've spoken about TRI a little bit ago. I'm trying to understand, so the interest in TRI data strictly the air component, or is it all components of a TRI data report?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are currently just focusing on air for this project. The facility attributes part of the work that is going on in FRS does envision encompassing all media, but for the emissions part, I wouldn't be able to say for whether that would affect other media for TRI or not, but just as an aside, the FRS isn't limited to just air, but for the streamlining that we're looking to do, it is just part of TRI.
Okay, so for TRI air emissions, and that kind of rests upon the facility identification going across the programs, right?
Are you saying TRI has cross-media facility identification?
No, it's more of the idea that TRI is a multimedia program, and we're only interested, for combined air emissions reporting, we're only interested in the air component from TRI facilities, but you have to identify those facilities in TRI and match them across programs. So for a facility identification, is it a multimedia facility ID approach, or is it going to be just kind of stripping out emissions from TRI and then doing something with those? I'm just trying to figure it out.
I mean, I think for the facilities that are reporting to TRI for air and have air emissions, those are going to be the facilities of interest for, of common interest for this project potentially. If those facilities are also reporting to a state for NEI purposes or to another one of the programs, there's streamlining to be done. If there's not those multiple entities that are getting, or multiple programs that are having to be reported to, then there's not a lot of streamlining that can happen for that particular facility. Not to say that they're not included, because they are part of the umbrella of all the sources that report to air emissions, but that wouldn't be the type of facility that we'd necessarily start with. And I think we'll have a lot to learn, with some of these facilities that do have to report to multiple programs. But if there's just a facility that has media emissions to air, to water or land and not air, at this point, I don't really see a role for that type of facility in this project.
Oh, no, I understand that. I was just thinking of more along the lines of they have air, water, and land emissions.
Yeah, and we don't know how that's going to work. I mean, the TRI folks have raised that, and it could be a challenging issue. It will be a challenging issue.
Okay, well, that helps, though. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So that looks like those are all of our questions that have been chatted in at this point. So Mark and Bryan,
hold on one second, Megan.
Yeah.
Megan, in the chat, I see a question that came in. Did it not go to everybody?
I'm looking now.
From Ginny Holton.
Okay, I will unmute. Ginny, I will unmute you. Give me just one moment. Ginny, you are unmuted. Ginny, are you there? Okay, well, why don't we read that? Mark, do you want to read it?
Sure. It says, it seems that trying to combine TRI, which is a facility-wide value, annual emissions from a wide variety of sources, often based on production-based emission factors that are not associated with a particular stack, with concentration-based information or other specifics that are required for state emission inventories. Most stack tests are points in time under maximum type operations and require very specific stack information, and emission inventories are somewhere in between, being annual totals for multiple fuels or varied operations. The same for GHGs, where sources can be aggregated. This seems overly complicated reporting and will result in more, not less, effort and QA issues. So the way I'm reading this question is, Ginny is correctly pointing out that the different programs have different resolutions for which the reporting of emissions is required, and that was something we acknowledged early in the presentation as being a significant challenge. I guess I would take some exception with the idea that TRI always allows certainly always allows an annual emissions value. At best case, it would be disaggregated by facility stacks and fugitives. And what we learned from at least some sources is to get that facility-wide value, they're actually adding up process level information and then submitting it to TRI as a facility-wide value. That's not going to be the case with every type of facility. But under the idea that TRI and NEI and the states are all looking for the best available information, where there is detailed information coming in to the state and then into the NEI, but yet facility total information going to TRI, that is where we would want to see consistency. And it doesn't make sense to us that the emissions from that facility would be one value for one program and another value for another program. And I understand, you're saying about the stack tests are very specific point in time, but both TRI and other annual emission reporting requirements are annual emissions totals. And when those facility totals don't match across programs, that is extremely hard for the public to understand. It's extremely hard for us to understand. And so we are looking in those cases to figure out ways that those emissions could be the same. If there's a situation where the facility is only reporting to TRI, there's no plan to make them do something more specific, but we also don't have the problem of the inconsistency. And I hope that answered your question. It's a good question.
Thanks, Mark. So we just got a question about will a recording of the presentation and slide deck be published and sent out to attendees?
So if you could go to the last slide, it has the URL, or maybe I can do that. Right, so there's already frequently asked questions from past webinars, and we will update that with any of the questions that are new from this webinar. And I don't know, Megan, what the plan is for the recording of this. I'll let you address that one.
Sure, so we do have a recording that we can make available.
Great.
That is the plan. And the previous webinar that covered similar topics is already recorded and available on the website. Okay, so if we have time for one last question here before we wrap up, there's one last one. Maybe take about a minute to do this. If a state decides to continue using its existing application and portal, how do you envision integrating the state application and portal with the other three reporting EPA programs, TRI, CEDRI, greenhouse gas, to meet the objectives of this effort?
Yeah, so in the case of, let me start with CEDRI because that's the easy case. CEDRI is already working with FRS and working with EIS to get the latest facility information that's been provided by the state. If the facility information has changed for some reason since the last time the facility reported, then there is already a process in place for dealing with that. That's at the facility level. But at the sub-facility level, we would have to work together with the state to figure out that process. So that really gets at the attribute sharing. For TRI and GHG, we don't exactly know how that's going to work. So you've hit upon one of the additional challenges. We've talked about whether through the sharing of the facility information, some of the information in TRI reporting systems and GHG reporting systems would be able to be pre-populated electronically as the facility goes through the interface, the state interface, to get to those potentially, and using some sort of widget or some way that the state website could potentially interface more seamlessly than is possible now with those other systems. But we don't know for sure. But having that type of widget has been one thing that's come up as an option, and maybe there'll be other things that come up as an option. I don't know if Brian or anybody else wants to say more about that, but that's how much we know now.
And I think that's the key to making this process accurate, seamless, and robust is to figure out what that approach is to accomplish that particular task.
Great. So that's our final question of the webinar. Marc and Bryan, do you want to wrap us up?
Well, I just want to say thanks. It's late on a Friday afternoon here on the East Coast, and as I said before, please contact us if you're interested in participating, and we look forward to hearing from you and learning what we can about your experiences and where you think this can be helpful.
Agree. Thank you for your time on this, and please, as we go along, we're likely to uncover more questions, and hopefully sharing those will help to ensure that we get to a product that is actually workable and doesn't have unintended consequences that we're working hard to avoid.
Great. I wanted to say thank you to the both of you as well for giving that presentation and answering all of those questions. And thank you to all of our participants today, and we wish you a happy weekend.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.